I binge watched Kaos on Netflix. Kaos is a new TV show on Netflix and it's all about Greek mythology. It features all of these different characters that actually do come from Greek mythology. As a former classicist whose master's thesis was literally in Greek and Roman mythology, these are my thoughts. Keep in mind that this is an adaptation. I don't care if it's not super accurate to the ancient primary sources because there are hundreds of those, but I'm here to tell you a little bit about the original stories of each of these characters that come up in Kaos. Having Jeff Goldblum as Zeus is just excellent choice. 10 out of 10 casting. Spoiler alert though, him having been previously a human and then turned into a god makes no sense. Zeus was most definitely always a god. So I don't love that, but I do love the cast. I love Janet McTeer as Hera, but there are parts of her storyline don't make any sense. Again, spoilers, her cheating on Zeus, especially with Poseidon, would never have happened in Greek mythology. Hera is the goddess of marriage and was famously so angry because of her inability to cheat on Zeus when Zeus constantly cheated on her. So she wouldn't be sleeping with Poseidon, nor would she be sleeping with Zeus's paramours, which happens in the show. Also, she didn't really turn Zeus's mortal lovers into bees. What she did to them was much worse, usually. Having a Maori Poseidon, I enjoyed this. But I think they might have made Poseidon a little bit too soft in the show. Poseidon is actually a terrible, terrible god who did awful, awful things, especially to mortals, also to some goddesses. But I do love that he lives on a yacht. His special relationship with the island of Crete I thought was very interesting, but we can get into that later. David Thewlis as Hades, I thought he was a very cute little bumbling, kind of old, very concerned with his own realm, very good at running it. That all checks out. This actor has a bit of actor baggage because didn't he play Mars/Ares in Wonder Woman? And I keep seeing Professor Lupin. I really enjoyed the characterization of Persephone because in mythology, Persephone does help Hades out with a lot of the running of the underworld. And in Kaos, like mythology, Persephone does actually make some of the decisions by herself without Hades. Or rather, she convinces Hades to make certain choices, like what happens with Orpheus, which we'll get to. Speaking of Orpheus, having Orpheus as this like Irish rock star, so funny. I love that. And him being absolutely obsessed and in love with his wife also checks out. I think that was clever. The story of Orpheus, if you didn't know, he was a musician, but he was also the son of a muse, Calliope, and he had a wife called Eurydice. Now, Eurydice tragically died early in their marriage, either by being bitten by a snake or stung by a bee, not getting hit by a truck like she does in Kaos. Orpheus, in his grief, does go into the underworld to retrieve his deceased wife. He uses his proficiency in music to make Cerberus fall asleep, just like in Harry Potter, and to convince Persephone and Hades to let him have his wife back and take her back to the real world. In Kaos, the show, Persephone lets Orpheus have Eurydice back behind Hades' back, which highlights that Persephone is more than just a wife and captive, and even in the show Kaos, she actually says that in a scene where she does love Hades and she does enjoy her role as queen. So let's talk about Eurydice. In the myths, we don't know much about her other than how much she is loved by Orpheus and loves Orpheus. That's why it's so interesting that in Kaos, Eurydice is not as in love with her husband as he is with her. This to me was very interesting. She's much more than a plot device. She has her own thoughts and feelings and desires, and in Kaos she has a very clear purpose, which I don't think we find out just yet. But she is actually more important of a character than her husband Orpheus. And the story of Orpheus and Eurydice has been used for hundreds of years in operas, in musicals, very much focusing on Orpheus and his journey to the underworld and his great love for his wife. So it's great to see Eurydice get her own storyline. Let's talk about Caeneus, aka Caeneus. This was something that I never thought I'd see on television, and I'm so excited about it. The story of Caeneus, aka Caeneus, is actually quite a tragic one in mythology. Caeneus is a woman who is desired by Poseidon, and in one or two versions, Caeneus asks Poseidon to turn her into a man in order to not have to sleep with him. And it happens, Poseidon turns her into a man and becomes Caeneus. So seeing a character called Caeneus, I was like, is this the same one that used to be a woman? And spoilers, sure enough, that is the storyline, at least while Caeneus was alive, having transitioned from female to male, but was previously an Amazon, which is not part of the original myth. And then Caeneus being a romantic lead, I'm obsessed. I love this. Did I mention that Caeneus is also played by a trans actor? I mean, perfect. The Cretan royal family. We've got President Minos, who is obviously meant to be King Minos from Greek mythology, his wife Pasiphae, and his daughter Ariadne. Now in the myth, they have another daughter called Phaedra, but in the TV show, instead of another daughter, they have another son called Glaucus. I won't spoil what happens there with the whole labyrinth and the Minotaur, and Daedalus is there as well. It's a very compelling story. I quite enjoyed it. I do love the character of Ariadne being quite strong, being quite independent. The Ariadne of mythology is quite intelligent, very helpful, and probably a bit too trusting. In Kaos, a kind of Trojan War seems to have taken place. What we have, instead of the utter destruction of Troy and all of the Trojan women taken as slaves and prisoners, we have a population of Trojan War refugees who come to Crete but are treated like second-class citizens. That was upsetting, but an interesting choice, especially since these Trojans seem to rebel against the gods, which for me doesn't make any sense because the Trojans from mythology had the same gods and were very pious. We've got Stephen Delane as Prometheus, who is also the narrator of Kaos. He spends the majority of the show chained to a rock having his liver eaten by an eagle, which is what happens in mythology. I just can't stop seeing Stannis Baratheon when I look at him. This story with Dionysus not enjoying his job as a god of revelry and drunkenness, I don't personally love that, but it makes sense for the show. I do, however, at the very end of the first season, I really like how he's starting to fall in love with Ariadne, the Cretan princess, because as we know from Greek mythology, Dionysus actually does end up marrying Ariadne and she becomes a goddess. So hopefully we see something similar happen. Certain characters from Greek mythology are kind of thrown into certain scenes for apparently no reason. Like Medusa seems to be a worker in the underworld, but also rebellious. And then we've got Polyphemus as someone who owns the dive bar, which is apparently also the entrance to the underworld. And he's just a guy with an eye patch, which I thought was so funny because Polyphemus is, of course, a cyclops in Greek mythology. The Fates and the Furies are two trios of ladies from Greek mythology, goddesses, and even though they are definitely divine beings in Kaos, they seem to be anti the gods. The Fates get destroyed by the gods, which makes no sense because they are themselves goddesses. And having a character called Theseus who ends up helping the Trojans and being homosexual doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for me, but I think they named him Theseus because of the way he was able to kind of manipulate Ariadne, which does make sense because that is what happens in the myth.